I suspect you're watching this video because, like many, at some point you have been told that in order to perform well, you need to do base training. And I'm going to put my hands up and admit, it's something I've preached over the years too. If you want a taller pyramid, you need to build a bigger base. Yeah, I'm sorry, because I'm not actually sure that is necessarily the case anymore, at least not for everyone. So, do you really need to do base training? Now, traditionally, base training is considered as a phase of training that focuses on longer and lower intensity training before moving on to higher intensity training as we get closer to racing. And it's normally performed over multiple weeks or months, often over the winter or off season. And you may have actually heard the term winter miles, summer smiles. Well, yeah, the aim of all these miles is to build our aerobic capacity and prepare our bodies for the harder, higher intensity training and racing to come. Makes a lot of sense. Well, yeah, it does, which is why we see a lot of pros performing some sort of base training phase, but they have 20 to 35 plus hours of training time per week. What about us ordinary folk cramming training in around work, daily life? Is it still beneficial? Well, I've caught up with Head of Sports Science at Precision Fuel and Hydration, Dr. Sam Shepherd, to hear his thoughts.
Base training is more specifically trying to improve both our aerobic threshold and then our ability to use fat as a fuel. And from an endurance athlete perspective, this makes complete sense. So these are key functional parameters that are going to be important for performance. It's also worth saying that they're not the only parameters, of course. So having a high VO2 max is obviously important as well. Pushing up our anaerobic threshold will be important. And this is where some of the harder work comes in. And that's essentially the kind of basis for the polarized training, or this 80-20 split that's often talked about. And then in terms of the adaptations that are happening and which we're trying to drive with base training, one of those is we're trying to increase the number or basically the network of mitochondria that we find in our muscles. The second adaptation that we're trying to induce is an increase in capillary density. So capillaries are basically tiny blood vessels that feed our muscles, and therefore they will deliver oxygen and nutrients to the muscle itself. And so base training will facilitate both of those adaptations essentially. So I think one of the main reasons that this idea of 80-20 being the split that might not work for age group athletes is simply due to their time availability. So, you know, I myself am a time crunched age group athlete, and this split is probably very different for me. And I think inducing or including a little bit more of the high intensity work and lower levels of base or zone 2 training periodically, relevant to the time in the season as well, is probably an effective way to go. With that in mind, probably one of the things that might be worth considering here is that as a professional athlete, then they have plenty of time to do this zone 2 training. As an age group athlete, then we can probably look at other manipulations, let's say, other strategies to incorporate alongside our training. It might bring up the effect of that training, not to the same level as an elite athlete would, who has 25 plus hours a week to do training, but it will start to make inroads into that, let's say, deficit. So nutrition is obviously a clear one, and improving recovery. You could almost say that they're even more important for an age group athlete to consider. For example, if you're doing easier training, you could do that in a carbohydrate restricted state. The caveat being that as long as it doesn't impact the quality of the training that you're doing, of course. But we know from research over the last 10 or 15 years that doing some sessions in a carbohydrate restricted state can lead to greater adaptations to the mitochondria and the capillaries as well. So that, you know, just simply selecting specific sessions where you might do them fasted, or you might do them without feeding carbohydrate for the first part of those sessions, something like that. As long as it doesn't impact the quality of the training, then you can potentially make up for that shortfall in the training volume that the elite athletes, the professionals, will be able to achieve anyway.
Yeah, and this is what I'm beginning to realise more and more, which, if I'm honest, does pay me a little, because I actually have very fond memories of my long weekend rides and runs with friends where we're not worrying about intervals coming up around the corner. All we're worrying about is what cafe we're going to stop off at next. Now, when I have been in hard training, I've actually almost enjoyed these less intense periods of training, the base training phases, mentally more than anything. I mean, I love the sport. I want to keep doing it for a really long time and not burning out, and I want to keep that desire there. So if we aren't pros and we are a little more time crunched, is there still any benefit to base training, even if it is small?
So we can certainly benefit from some base training, even if it is difficult to fit into the week or if it's only available for a small part of the week. So a really good way to do this might be that you during the week, when you've got limited time, you might be at work, then you could do some shorter running sessions that are largely aerobic. And then when it comes to the weekend and you've got an opportunity to spend a bit more time training, doing a longer, easier ride would be valuable as well. And I think that's what many age group athletes end up doing ultimately. Those two together are ultimately going to improve your aerobic threshold, teach the body to use fat as a fuel at those low intensity type sessions. And then you've obviously got the harder work to kind of support the more anaerobic threshold work, the VO2 max increases that we would expect from that type of work. If you're someone who's maybe just getting started with this, then base training is a great way to kind of establish that aerobic foundation. So in that case, a high proportion of the training might be done at a lower level, just while your body gets used to that level of activity. You might scatter in one or two higher intensity sessions. And as I've said before, we know that the higher intensity work is a great stimulus to increase that mitochondrial content in the muscles. So that's important. If you are someone who is much more experienced, then you might be able to reduce or change the time that you are spending doing that base work, particularly during the winter months when it's dark and cold and miserable outside in the UK at least. You could be including more work, above LT1 and LT2, and then that might replace some of the more traditional zone 2 work. Not all of it, of course, but just some of it through the darker months, let's say.
Well, as with anything in triathlon, there will always be differing opinions on how to best structure training, or specifically a base phase. And as Dr. Sam has mentioned already, one of the biggest limiting factors when trying to reach optimal performance for an amateur triathlete will be their pace or power at VO2 max and lactate threshold intensities. So in theory, it makes sense to do more work at these higher intensity levels. And what's great is improved capacity at these high intensity levels leads to improved capacity at the low intensity levels. So it's a win-win, right?
We know that you can only sort of make improvements in VO2 max and maybe lactate threshold for sort of 8 to 10 weeks using the same type of stimulus, using those harder sessions. So you want to obviously avoid reaching that point where you're plateauing. And so then you need to look at alternative ways of training. So going back to the sort of key adaptations that occur when we do that high intensity work, then you're going to increase primarily the mitochondrial content in your muscles. Now, we've already said that part of the adaptations which will improve us as an athlete is also an increase in the number of capillaries in our muscles, or feeding our muscles as well. And so if we just simply focused on doing hard training sessions all the time, then yes, we're going to increase our mitochondrial content, but that's going to plateau off after that 8 to 10 week period. And yes, undoubtedly that's going to improve the cell's ability to generate energy. But at some point, there's going to be a need for oxygen by the mitochondria to help generate energy, which will be higher than the capacity to actually deliver that oxygen to the muscle at the required rate. So it's almost like the mitochondrial content and the mitochondrial demand has outstripped the supply that can be given by the blood vessels and the capillaries that are feeding the muscle with oxygen and nutrients. So that's why we need to find this balance between doing the harder sessions that will induce some adaptations, but then we also need to remain, cognizant of the fact that the lower lower end work, the zone 2 work, is also going to create some really beneficial adaptations. And together, the two are ultimately what we need to do to continue to adapt and improve.
Okay, so baby base training isn't dead altogether. Now I thought we should take a step back and look at how you might periodize a season in ideal terms. So you have this base phase, or whatever you want to call it, the build phase, the peak, and finally the taper, just before race day. Now this is a pretty typical way of periodizing a season, and you actually likely already do something like this without really realizing. How long you spend in each of these phases will differ from individual to individual, and obviously on what race distance you're targeting. So let's work back from the race. The taper might just be a week or so. The peak phase, normally a couple of weeks. And then the build phase might be in the region of 8, maybe even as much as 12 weeks. So that's 3 to 4 months of quality work and prep. Now let's imagine you've just kicked off your training in November with your first race in May next year. That leaves us approximately 3 months in this base phase, which is a pretty chunky bit of time. So whilst we've learned that solely doing high intensity training for this period probably isn't wise, also simply doing easy training for the sake of base training also isn't the best use of our limited time. So I repeat, base training is not dead, we just need to be smarter about it. Now, from all the research and experience I've gained, this is my base training 101. For the first few weeks of training should always be light with a gradual increase in volume. Now, I always recommend using this early period of base training to focus on any biomechanical or technical issues to make yourself more efficient, but also obviously reduce injury risk going forwards. You know, going back to basics with your front crawl and sorting out those sinky legs, for example. Start also including some strength work, be that in workouts and or specific strength training in the gym or at home. Strength training may feel like it gets in the way of your swimming, cycling and running, but it's actually a very time efficient route to improving your strength in each of the disciplines. So don't be scared to sub out one of them in place of some strength training. As you move into the middle of your base phase, you might like to start including some very short, hard, maybe max efforts, like 20-second hill sprints. This may not seem very specific to triathlon endurance, but they're actually fantastic for neuromuscular recruitment and really complement that strength training that hopefully you've been doing. And as we progress, you may like to start making the occasional easy workout a little tougher, maybe a tempo effort. And as you hit the end of the base phase, some of these tempo efforts may start to knock on the door of threshold, preparing you for workouts of either even higher intensities or for threshold work of longer duration coming at you very soon in the next phase of training. Now, mixing things up at this time of year can be really good for motivation, particularly if, like here in the UK, weather and daylight hours is not always on our side. And if you really feel like you still need to get some big miles in your legs before the race season, well, maybe this is the excuse that you've been looking for to book yourself a week in Mallorca for some long rides each day. Thank me later. Well, thank you guys for tuning in and watching today's video of me kind of trying to debunk and understand base training. And it's been quite interesting, actually. I've learned a lot today. Let me know if you have learned something and what your thoughts are on base training, how you attack base training each year, if you do at all. Or maybe you call it something else. Let us know in the comment section down below. If you've enjoyed today's video, please do give it a thumbs up, give it a like, and we'll see you next time.